Morbid Facts, Part 204. Shortly after going missing for 6 days, Edgar Allan Poe died a mysterious death. When he was found, he was wearing another man's cheap clothing and couldn't explain where he'd been. Acting delirious and distressed, he was brought to the hospital where he died of unknown causes at the age of 40. Bella and Edward's relationship throughout the Twilight series meets all 15 official criteria for an abusive relationship. Up until the 1800s, Turkish women who were accused of cheating on their husbands were tied up in a sack filled with cats, then thrown in the ocean. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up damaging only one office room, and he was the only person that died. Morbid Facts, Part 205. To unlock the secrets of a genius, the man who performed Einstein's autopsy stole his brain and kept it in a jar for 20 years. He found that the part of Einstein's brain that processes math and language was 15% bigger than the average human's. Throughout history, a total of 9 nuclear submarines have been lost around the world. Most of them are still on the ocean floor with nuclear weapons that are still intact. A 17-year-old boy from Mexico City died after his girlfriend gave him a hickey. The suction created a blood clot that traveled to his brain, eventually causing a stroke. When the Soviet Union was pushing toward Berlin during World War II, a Nazi SS soldier was forced to play piano for his captors. They made it clear to him in sign language that he would be executed the moment he stopped playing. He played for 22 straight hours, after which he collapsed in tears. They congratulated him, then shot him. This is why your parents always check your Halloween candy before you eat it. On Halloween in 1974, Ronald O'Brien laced his 8-year-old son's pixie sticks with cyanide so that he could claim the boy's life insurance. He also gave the candy to 4 other kids to set up the story that a local madman had poisoned them. Once police received word of the first boy's death, 3 of the 4 remaining candies were recovered quickly, but one was still out there. When the parents of this final child were informed by police, they became hysterical when they couldn't find the pixie stick in their son's bag. So they rushed upstairs to find the boy in his bed with the poisoned candy in his hand. He had thankfully been unable to open the wrapper because of the staple that was used to reseal it. So Timothy O'Brien ended up being the only confirmed case of a kid dying from poisoned Halloween candy, and it was done by his own father. Morbid Facts, Part 207. After a failed circumcision led to a sex reassignment surgery, David Reimer was raised as a girl. Once he found out that he was in fact not a girl, Reimer started living as a male at the age of 15. But after years of suffering from severe depression and confusion, Reimer took his own life at the age of 38. Many shelters won't allow black cats to be adopted around Halloween time, out of fear that they might be tortured or sacrificed. In many cities across the US, people on the sex offender registry have to keep their outdoor lights off during Halloween. This is a 1948 photo of a Chicago mother hiding her face in shame after putting her children up for sale. 2 of them were sold to an abusive family for $2 apiece so that their mother could afford rent. Their new father would often tie them up in a barn and force them to work long hours, often referring to them as slaves. Morbid Facts, Part 208. If you were to swim near a pod of narwhals and happen to hear one whistle, it might be the last thing that you ever hear. The sounds that narwhals make are so loud that they're said to be deafening to humans. In 2006, a 38-year-old woman who had been missing for 3 years was found dead in her London home with the TV still running. Cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 63 global vertebrate species. They're often considered to be one of the most environmentally damaging invasive predators on the planet. In 2018, a woman who received a lung transplant went into anaphylactic shock after eating peanuts even though she'd never been allergic before. She later discovered that the boy who gave her the lungs had a peanut allergy and actually died from anaphylactic shock himself. Morbid Facts, Part 209. In 1912, President Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the chest just before giving a speech. Upon noticing the bullet missed his lungs, he carried on despite the blood seeping from his shirt. He delivered the full 90-minute speech before accepting medical attention. The first bomb dropped by the Allies during World War II killed the only elephant in the Berlin Zoo. Alfonso Flores from Texas received a major cosmetic surgery to increase his height from 5'11" to 6'1". He claimed it allowed him to finally achieve his dream of becoming tall. In 2009, Larry Maria Moncada from Iowa disappeared after working his shift at the supermarket. He was missing for more than a decade until his body was found when the supermarket was renovated. The man had fallen into a small gap between the wall and cooler, likely dying from dehydration after a few days of being stuck. Morbid Facts, Part 214. In 2018, Sarah and Jennifer Hart drove a van carrying their 6 adopted children off a cliff. It was officially ruled a murder-suicide since the racist couple were abusive to their children for years. They only decided to end it all when they felt authorities closing in on their crimes. North Korean founder Kim Il-sung had a baseball-sized tumor on the back of his head that propaganda officials worked hard to hide. As a result, this is one of the only photos ever taken of the tumor. This disturbing drawing was created by a nonverbal dementia patient in a nursing home. A hitchhiking robot that relied on the kindness of strangers to travel the world made it safely across Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands. But just 2 weeks into its American tour, Hitchbot was found in Philadelphia with its arms and head ripped off. Morbid Facts, Part 215. An 18-year-old girl from Alaska was encouraged to murder her best friend by a boy she met online who claimed to be a multimillionaire. She then convinced 4 others to help her so that they could split a $9 million prize. It ended up being a total scam perpetrated by a mentally disabled man from Indiana. The assassin bug wears the corpses of its prey like a backpack. After stabbing its prey and slurping out the innards, the insect uses the corpses as armor and camouflage. In 1991, Patricia Stallings was sentenced to life in prison for poisoning her child with antifreeze. She then gave birth to a second child while in prison, who was given to a foster care. But he eventually became sick with the same symptoms as the first child, indicating a rare metabolic disorder, not poisoning. This proved her innocence and she was released. Morbid Facts, Part 216. When Mary Ann Bevan was 32 years old, she was a beautiful nurse who was happily married with 4 children. But all of that changed in 1906 when she began suffering from acromegaly, a disease that doctors couldn't quite understand at the time. Mary was experiencing migraines and joint pain that turned into abnormal facial growth and distortion. Within 5 years, she looked like a completely different person and saw her beauty continue to fade with each day. Due to her ugliness, she was eventually fired from her job, and in 1914, her husband Thomas died from a stroke, leaving Anne and the 4 children behind. Desperate to feed her kids, Anne decided to enter a contest and won the offensive title of Ugliest Woman in the World. She was offered a job at Dreamland Circus in Coney Island, where she endured daily ridicule for 13 years until her death in 1933. Morbid Facts, Part 217. In 2017, a Utah woman was murdered by her husband while on a murder mystery-themed cruise in Alaska. Many of the passengers thought that the screams coming from their cabin were all just part of the show. Within 3 days of dying, the bacteria in your stomach that digested your food will begin to digest you. Sent to a German mental hospital in 1907, Katerina Drexel made a husband doll out of straw. It's said that she brought the doll everywhere she went, interacting with it as if it were a living person. In 2015, a Scottish farmer reported seeing a car crash on the side of a highway. It took police 3 days to respond, and by the time they did, they found Lamara Bell in critical condition next to her dead partner. She would succumb to her injuries 4 days later due to the negligence. Morbid Facts, Part 219. The details revealed in Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was almost completely bald and had a number of cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner. He had puncture wounds all over his arms and had nothing but pills in his stomach at the time of death. Michael had also undergone at least 10 nose jobs, leaving him with a left nostril that was almost completely collapsed. In 1963, the Bronx Zoo had an exhibit called The Most Dangerous Animal in the World. The entire exhibit was just a mirror. Serial killer Richard Chase once attempted to enter a woman's home but walked away after realizing her doors were locked. Chase later told detectives that he took locked doors as a sign that he wasn't welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside. Morbid Facts, Part 220. A man named Martin Pistorius once endured a 12-year coma even though he was completely aware of his surroundings. He could see and hear everything, including his mother saying she hoped he would die. But he couldn't show any signs of consciousness and was completely trapped with nothing but his thoughts. In 1965, a machine was patented to deliver a baby using centrifugal force. The machine would spin the woman until the baby came out, and he or she would be caught in a net. In Switzerland, public restrooms are lit with blue lights so that junkies can't find their veins. This is an example of an underground dungeon called an oubliette in Warwick Castle. Prisoners were often dumped in these extremely narrow passages and forgotten about until they starved to death. Many of these dungeons were also placed under privies, meaning the prisoner would be the recipient of all the human waste in the castle. Morbid Facts, Part 221. A 42-year-old British woman received over $70,000 in donations after setting up a GoFundMe to fund her cancer treatment. But it turned out she was a total fraud and was instead using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle and gambling addiction. When Disney released Princess and the Frog, it caused a minor salmonella outbreak across the country. Over 50 kids were hospitalized after kissing a frog. The heaviest human ever recorded weighed 1,400 pounds at his peak. He once lost over 900 pounds only to gain it all back later in life. In the original Little Mermaid, the mermaid's feet constantly feel like she's walking on sharp knives. But the prince enjoys watching her dance, so she continues dancing for hours despite the excruciating pain. The prince then goes on to marry someone else and the mermaid takes her own life. Morbid Facts, Part 222. Donda West was turned down by many plastic surgeons before she found one who would perform on her despite her heart condition. Sadly, as a result of the surgery, she died the next day, and Kanye has blamed himself ever since. The last French soldier to die in World War I was killed just 15 minutes before the ceasefire. He was trying to deliver a message to his unit that soup would be served for lunch. A man from Turkey locked his head in a cage for weeks in an attempt to quit smoking. His wife held on to the key and only opened it for meals and sleep. In 2014, General Motors recalled 2.5 million cars for faulty ignitions. The cars would literally shut off while being driven, so drivers would lose control of their brakes and airbags wouldn't deploy. GM knew about the problem since 2005, but never fixed it because it would be too expensive. And as a result, over 100 people died. Morbid Facts, Part 223. Contrary to what was reported at the time, Ronald Reagan lost more than half his blood and came within seconds of dying when he was shot in 1981. His true condition was concealed from the public for nearly 30 years. In an average lifetime, human skin completely replaces itself more than 900 times. A Russian woman named Kristina Ozturk is addicted to having kids and vows to have over 100 by the time she turns 30. She's only 23 years old and already has 11 kids with her 56-year-old husband. In 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die in space. His craft had over 200 known flaws, but his attempts to delay the flight were rejected. Had he refused the mission, his friend Yuri Gagarin would have been sent instead. Vladimir specifically asked the authorities to give him an open casket funeral after the mission. Morbid Facts, Part 224. In the famous first edition of Playboy, Hugh Hefner published nude photos of Marilyn Monroe without her permission. He later purchased the crypt beside her even though they'd never met in life, and now he's buried next to her. The Great Smog of London in 1952 was so bad that pedestrians couldn't even see their shoes. It resulted in the deaths of 4,000 people, many of whom fell into the Thames River and drowned simply because they couldn't see it. In 1998, Tom and Eileen Lonergan were left behind during a diving trip in the Great Barrier Reef. It took 2 days for anyone to even notice before an extensive search was launched. 6 months later, their clothes and gear washed up along with a dive slate that read, "Please rescue us before we die." Their ultimate cause of death remains unknown since their bodies were never recovered. Morbid Facts, Part 225. As part of a fundraising publicity stunt in 1986, United Way released 1.5 million balloons in Cleveland, Ohio. But the event resulted in utter disaster since the balloons clogged various waterways and even shut down an airport. They also interrupted a Coast Guard search for 2 missing boaters who were later found to have drowned. As a sign of mourning, ancient Egyptians would often shave their eyebrows when their cats died. David Gaines earned 5 bachelor degrees at the same time at the University of Connecticut, but he sadly drowned and died just a few months after graduating because he never learned how to swim. If you ever have a kidney stone, just take a ride on Thunder Mountain in Disney World. After hearing rumors, a Michigan urologist took kidney models filled with stones on the ride. He found that the stones were passed up to 70% of the time depending on where he sat. Morbid Facts, Part 226. Of all the atrocities committed during World War II, few compare to the gruesome experiments performed by Japanese Unit 731. It was a biological warfare research unit that conducted on unwitting subjects who were often prisoners of war. Some of the earlier, more mild experiments involved injecting pathogens such as anthrax and cholera into subjects. But as the war intensified, their trials became increasingly extreme. For example, they left babies in the freezing cold and blew people's legs off with grenades to see how long it would take them to die. In one experiment, scientists peeled the skin off of living people to learn how much skin you could peel off before killing someone. At least 3,000 subjects were experimented on, and all of them died. And perhaps worst of all, the researchers of Unit 731 were granted immunity by the US in exchange for the horrific data they gathered. Morbid Facts, Part 227. 19-year-old Australian Sam Ballard was a star rugby player until he was dared to eat a garden slug at a team party. The slug ended up infecting him with a condition called rat lungworm, which paralyzed him and eventually killed him 8 years later. In 2014, it was reported that Kim Jong-un killed his own uncle by throwing him into a cage filled with hundreds of stray dogs. In Berlin, Germany, there's now a playground on top of the site where Hitler allegedly killed himself during World War II. Before she bled to death, the last words Ruth Pelkey said to her killer Paula Cooper were, "If you kill me, you will be sorry." 30 years after the murder, Paula took her own life shortly after being released from prison. She wrote in a suicide note that, quote, "I have taken a life and never felt worthy." Morbid Facts, Part 232. Serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer was brutally killed in prison when another inmate beat him to death with a metal bar. The killer later revealed that he did it because he was sick of Jeffrey making the prison food look like severed limbs to tease the other inmates. Dutch passenger Cor Pan jokingly made this post just months after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 went missing. Little did he know his own flight would meet a similar fate, as MH17 was shot down over Ukraine, killing everyone on board. Hannibal of Carthage was famous for intimidating his Roman enemies through the use of war elephants. But the Romans eventually learned that elephants are afraid of squealing pigs, so they would lather pigs in tar and set them on fire, sending the enemy elephants fleeing in horror. This is where the term war pigs originated from. Morbid Facts, Part 233. In the 1980s, Japanese film director Hideshi Hino made a gory horror film series called Guinea Pig. The effects he used were so realistic that Charlie Sheen thought he was watching people die for real and reported it to the FBI. Hino had to go to court to prove that the effects were fake and that all of the cast members were still alive. Astronauts need to sleep near a fan so that when they exhale, there isn't a CO2 cloud in front of their face that causes them to suffocate. Co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous Bill Wilson was denied after begging for whiskey on his deathbed and died 36 years sober. This is a photo of the Apollo 1 crew jokingly praying over a miniature of their command module. All three would die from a flash fire that swept through their actual command module in 1967. Morbid Facts, Part 234. A Dutch teenager who was going bungee jumping in Spain died after a horrible misunderstanding. The instructor, who had poor English, said no jump, but she heard it as now jump and ended up jumping straight to her death. This is exactly why commands are never supposed to be given with a no or a don't. President JFK's convertible wasn't scrapped when he was assassinated in 1963. They just welded a roof on top and it was used by the next 4 presidents right up until 1977. Mohammed Bajay was an Iranian serial killer who raped and killed at least 40 young boys in the early 2000s. But his crimes only gained worldwide attention because of the way in which he was executed. He was stoned by an angry mob, lashed 100 times, stabbed by the brother of one of his victims, and then hanged. Morbid Facts, Part 235. Slovenian woman Julia Adlisic cut off her own hand with a table saw and purposely left it at home when she went to the hospital. She did this to receive $1.2 million in payout from the 5 insurance companies she signed up for. But instead of getting paid, she was sentenced to 2 years in jail for insurance fraud. Anyone who moves to Villas Las Estrellas in Antarctica must have their appendix preemptively removed because the nearest hospital is over 600 miles away. This is an image of a patient with claustrophobia who panicked during a CT scan. This little girl is the stepdaughter of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Directly under her bedroom was the crawl space where John stuffed the bodies of 26 of his victims, meaning she literally slept over a graveyard. Morbid Facts, Part 236. Human injuries from stingrays are extremely rare and almost never fatal. When Steve Irwin was killed by one in 2006, he was only the second reported stingray fatality in Australia since 1945. It was a total freak accident that he only died from because the barb went directly into his heart. In 1921, spiritualists Thomas Bradford and Ruth Doran wanted to test whether it was possible to communicate with the dead. So naturally, Bradford killed himself via carbon monoxide poisoning and planned to appear in front of Doran as a ghost. He never did. In 2014, scientists found a giant 30,000-year-old virus in Russian permafrost. After thawing out, the virus was still infectious and even began killing amoebas. This raised concerns that melting or drilling into Arctic ice could unleash previously undiscovered pathogenic viruses. Morbid Facts, Part 237. In 2002, two airplanes collided over Germany, killing all 71 total passengers on board. 2 years later, the air traffic controller who was responsible was stabbed to death by a Russian man named Vitaly Kaloyev, whose wife and 2 kids were victims of the crash. Kaloyev was only sentenced to 2 years in prison and was hailed as a hero back in Russia. In 2019, a British teenager went blind after maintaining a horrendous diet for several years. It consisted of French fries, white bread, Pringles, and the occasional slice of ham. In 2013, Disney abandoned their policy of letting disabled people skip lines at their theme parks. This was because too many people were hiring disabled tour guides to help them skip the lines. Morbid Facts, Part 238. In 2003, Kenneth Maxwell called 911 to report a house fire that he came across while driving home from work. But his voice suddenly cut off during the call, and when firemen arrived at the scene, Kenneth was found shot dead in his car. It turned out the fire was created to cover up a double homicide, and the killer saw Kenneth making the call. Morticians often use these spiky contacts to keep the eyes of the dead closed during funeral viewings. During World War II, one of the first Japanese cities that the US planned on nuking was its former capital, Kyoto. The only reason it wasn't bombed was because US Secretary of War Henry Stimson spent his honeymoon there and thought it was a nice place. So instead of Kyoto, they went with Nagasaki. Morbid Facts, Part 239. These are photos of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko before and after he was poisoned by Vladimir Putin in 2004. He and his family believe the assassination attempt was ordered because Yushchenko wanted Ukraine to integrate more with the rest of Europe. A doctor chronicled the progression of Alzheimer's disease in one of his patients by collecting her signatures on medical forms over the years. Ever since the Taliban takeover, the price for a kidney on the Afghan black market has dropped from $4,000 to $1,500. This is because so many people have been selling their own kidneys just so they can afford to feed their children. Such high supply of the organ has caused the price to plummet in short time. Morbid Facts, Part 240. In 1981, Japanese college student Issei Sagawa invited over his classmate Renee Hartfelt for dinner at his apartment. He told the 25-year-old Dutch student that he would help her translate some poetry for a school assignment, but his real plan was much darker. As Hartfelt was reading from a poem, Sagawa shot her in the back of the head and killed her instantly. He spent the next 2 days eating her flesh so that he could absorb her health and beauty, characteristics which he felt he lacked. It was a plan that was decades in the making, but it only took police 2 days to arrest him. But a French court deported him to Japan, where he avoided serving any jail time due to a legal technicality. He remains free to this day and even says he wants to taste human flesh again before he dies. Morbid Facts, Part 242. King Tut is the only ancient Egyptian mummy known to have been mummified with an erection. His ancient member unfortunately broke off soon after the tomb was discovered. The 1897 Battle of Sarigari is considered to be one of the greatest final stands in history. 21 soldiers of the Sikh regiment fought off an army of 10,000 Afghans and killed 600 of them before being defeated. In 1881, 20th U.S. President James Garfield survived an assassination attempt, but one of the 2 bullets pierced his intestine. As a result, he was unable to hold down any food he ate, so doctors had to resort to something drastic. For the final 3 months of his life, the president was fed egg yolks, milk, and whiskey through his butthole. Morbid Facts, Part 243. In the early 2000s, CEO Stuart Parnell created a salmonella outbreak by purposely tainting his peanut products to save some cash. As a result of his greediness, 9 people died and hundreds of others got sick. This photo shows Parnell refusing to talk when a member of Congress challenges him to eat his own products in front of a committee. The Altamira man is an extremely well-preserved fossil of a Neanderthal who fell down a sinkhole over 100,000 years ago. Discovered in 1993, experts are still working on a way to extract the skeleton from the calcite without damaging it. Stephen King would do so much cocaine while writing that he had to stuff cotton up his nose to prevent blood from dripping onto his typewriter. There are various books that he doesn't even remember writing, including the 1981 classic Cujo. Morbid Facts, Part 244. In 1989, the Buffalo Sabres goalie had his neck sliced by another player's skate, which severed his carotid artery. It resulted in so much blood loss that 11 fans fainted, 2 had heart attacks, and 3 players uked on the ice. His life was saved by the team trainer, who luckily served in the Vietnam War as a combat medic. When he was executed in 1793, King Louis XVI was so fat for the guillotine that it took 2 attempts to fully cut through. About 10,000 Facebook users die every day. Eventually, the number of dead profiles will outnumber the living ones, and Facebook will become a digital graveyard. This is what a Japanese execution chamber looks like, where convicts are killed by long drop hanging through a trap door. In Japan, prisoners on death row aren't told when they'll be executed until 1 hour before it happens. Morbid Facts, Part 245. When President JFK was assassinated, he was wearing a corset to help with his chronic back pain. Experts say it likely restricted his body and prevented him from ducking down after the first shot. For nearly 300 years, the office of the Pope was almost certainly a death sentence. 30 out of the first 31 popes were violently murdered. George Washington died because his doctors tried to cure his sore throat by draining his blood. He lost more than half his blood before they stopped the treatment, and he died hours later. This photo shows neo-Nazi leader Jeff Hall with his 10-year-old son Joseph in April of 2011. The morning after this was taken, Joseph murdered his father by shooting him in the head while he was asleep. The boy said he was simply tired of Jeff abusing his family, but a court still sentenced him to 10 years in prison.